That's what I was trying to figure out.
All right, that makes sense.
Yeah. Rather than studio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, starting
Welcome.
over. Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of the podcast. There have been no technical difficulties whatsoever. Everything's been flowing very perfectly. Joining us on the podcast is Professor Erin Nolan. Erin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. I took a class with Professor Nolan this past semester, and I thought it was definitely relevant to our work in the museum. So we're going to be getting into that as we go through here. But why don't you first introduce yourself, tell us about your role at Bates, all that fun jazz.
Sounds good. Well, I'm thrilled to be here with you. We're missing Lucy today.
Yes.
So this is the end of my first year at Bates. I am a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Art and Visual Culture, and I teach classes in the History and Criticism track. My classes range across a variety of fields, I guess, and intersecting my own interests in global modernism, histories of photography, and art from the Islamic world, as well as thinking about institutions and the way in which these histories are institutionalized, which of course brings us to the class that you took,
Yes.
which was called Decolonizing the Museum.
Definitely an interesting class. Not really something that I had thought very much about in the past. I think it's really easy to walk into a museum and not really think that much about the museum as a sort of an entity, which was a cool thing to examine. But yeah, before we talk too much about the details of the class, why don't you talk about some of your background in museums and kind of how you got into this work?
Yeah. So, well, this is a long story, but I'll try to keep it a little bit short. As I get older, it gets longer and longer.
That's okay.
I'll give you a little sort of anecdotal background and then talk about maybe the choices I made and how those brought me here. After college, I was an art history major. I went to Tufts University undergrad.
Oh.
And after college, I interned in New York for the summer at Pace Gallery, working with their photographs. And then I moved to Europe, and I worked at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice, which was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I did everything there from sell tickets to guard galleries to rehang the whole collection. So I was carrying Picasso's and Kandinsky's upstairs, as well as work with conservators from the Pompidou to install an installation that they had when I was there. And upon returning to the United States, I was looking for a job, and the job that I got was in the Islamic art department at the Harvard Art Museums.
That's so cool.
It was really cool,
I'm
though
slightly
I didn't
jealous
even
of it.
realize how cool it was when I got the job.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so lucky to have landed that, and it shaped my career in ways that I was totally unaware of at 23.
Uh-huh.
And it certainly, to be honest with you, when I was that age and looking for a job, it wasn't the job that I thought that I wanted. In part because I never took an Islamic art class as an undergrad, which I fully regret now.
I did not realize that. I kind of assumed you had. So.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
And I regret it for many reasons. One of them being that the professor that I would have taken classes with at Tufts is this amazing scholar named Ava Hoffman,
Mm-hmm.
whose work I teach in my classes now. So I missed that opportunity. But, we live and learn. And so I started in the Islamic art department at Harvard, and I became acquainted with one of the most important collections of Islamic art in the United States. And I got to hold the objects and work with professors and students to learn about the objects and to assist the curators with different projects. And it was really an incredible experience, and planted this seed for me at the time, which, I wouldn't go back to grad school for 6 more years,
Mm-hmm.
but it really planted the seed in terms of the kinds of questions that I was interested in exploring in my own research.
Gotcha.
And part of that had to do with the fact that while I was in the department at Harvard, there was a donor who was interested in forming a collection of contemporary South Asian photographs. And because I was interested in photographs and I was in the Islamic art department, they very generously allowed me to work on that initiative. And it was an initiative that bridged the gap between the photo department and the Islamic art department, which were two departments that had historically not engaged with each other. And again, this really shaped my own thinking in the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask about art history. So yes, there is a way in which part of my interest was to reject the monolithic assumptions about Islamic art, right? To instead to look at specific and local histories that intersect and entangle, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I think that brings us very nicely into the class, Decolonizing the Museum. So, I mean, a couple of like the basic questions we might know, like what does that mean? I guess that's not really a basic question, but
Yeah.
what does decolonizing the museum mean to you? Kind of how'd you get the idea for the class, and kind of what was that like putting that together?
Yeah. So I'm going to skip back a little bit and
Sure.
connect my answer from the previous question to this question.
Yeah.
In part because my own work in museums at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, the Harvard Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City, which is where I worked after Harvard, was really important in my own thinking about constructing this class and constructing a class that deals with institutional critique and institutional histories.
Yeah.
And I think if I hadn't had that experience on the ground working in institutions where I was working for a time in a curatorial department, I worked as a museum registrar organizing loans and an exhibition manager. If I didn't have that kind of practical real life experience, I feel like it would be, I think it really enhances my own appreciation of what museums can do. And so I was able to have the incredible experience of inhabiting the world of a museum working day to day and appreciate the logistics of that. And now I can sit back and also teach in a classroom where we can reflect on that and critique it.
Right. Because I think that was interesting. I mean, like, 'cause in the class, obviously, we're talking in a very theoretical way because we're in the classroom, but it's. I mean, you've had the experience working there, so it's not like it's all just detached from the reality of museums. It's very much rooted in your own experiences there, which I think is very important to appreciating the work that we were doing there.
Yeah, and so to go back and I'm not trying to dodge your question about what it means to decolonize the museum. I think so. This is the question, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to decolonize the museum? Why is this an important class to be teaching right now?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think a lot of things about this, and I'll try to keep them brief. I feel as though as we started in our class, the last 3 years particularly have really changed how museums exist in the world. And by that, I mean, I can point to specific moments, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
I think in the United States, the Trump presidency.
Sure.
And the movement towards racial justice with the murdering of George Floyd.
Right.
And so I think all of those things together have forced museums to reckon with their imperial and colonial pasts in ways that previously they were not forced to reckon with as directly, right? Museums have always been imperial institutions, but not until more recently have they had to face them so directly.
Right. It kind of like an indirect sort of, yes, it's there, but it's not really being focused on very much.
I mean, I think it depends on, it's an institution to institution
Yeah.
question, right? We wouldn't want to generalize about all of the museums in the world, right? But I do think that there is this attention to not only the institutional history of collecting
Right.
in museums, questions of representation, both on the staff and in the galleries, that museums are really dealing with in ways that they have not previously. And so I think that it's always been there, right? It's one of those histories that has been, well, not one of those histories, it is actually many histories, that have been silenced and have been overlooked. And now I think museums are really addressing or trying to address the fact that they are products of imperial and colonial power.
Yeah. I mean, when your entire staff is getting furloughed, right, it does sort of tend to make you think about how you work in a day-to-day way. I mean, I'm coming into working in a museum after the pandemic and after all these things, so it's a little bit I haven't seen as much of the before, but it's interesting. There's definitely a sense of there being a kind of like a bit of a reset and a bit of a reevaluation happening in a way that's I think is pretty palpable. So it kind of makes the class topic, I think, very very relevant to what museums are doing now.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think I will just say, like, even though I did have a significant experience working in museums, which I absolutely loved and feel is really important
Yeah.
to my own thinking, I don't work in museums now.
Right.
And I think working in a museum now would be a very different experience than what I had. And so I just also want to acknowledge that,
Right.
that
Yeah.
I chose a different path, right? I chose to work in academia rather than to return to museums after getting my PhD. And that was a conscious choice on my part. But I also am coming at this kind of discussion from a theoretical place now where as colleagues and dear, dear friends of mine are not, right? This is something that they deal with on the floor every day. So,
Yeah.
so I just want to acknowledge that, like, I'm not speaking from the place of working within a specific art museum or collecting institution now,
Right.
but from a place of an academic who can see, who is looking at that from the outside.
Right. Yeah. To talk about the content of the class in a little more detail, what do you think were some of the more interesting or sort of engaging discussions that we had in the class, or in particular some of the things that are kind of less obvious maybe to somebody who doesn't know as much about the history of museums or things like that? What are some of the more interesting kind of points of discussion that we were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that, to be honest, like, I wish I had more time between the end of the winter term and the start of short term at Bates to reflect on that. But I think I will have time over the summer to really process everything. Because, as you know, and as maybe your listeners can imagine, taking a class called Decolonizing the Museum is not, a walk in the park, right?
Yeah.
It's intense and it's challenging and it really forces you to be present, not just present intellectually, but present in your body in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to avoid the difficult topics that are sometimes being discussed. So it's not a light class, I would say, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. Yeah.
And so in that way, I feel like I also, as the instructor of the class, almost need more time to really process everything that we talked about. I loved teaching the class, and I loved the way in which students in the class really embraced the challenge of reimagining what museums are. And one of the things that I loved that we did in the very, very beginning was a group exercise where I asked you to define what museums were,
Yeah.
what museums are, and what museums will be in the future. And I thought that was really insightful and really illuminating for me to see how students could reflect on museum institutions historically. And this was at the very beginning of the semester before we had done reading about, curiosity cabinets and histories of, colonial collecting, or even engaging in debates about repatriation, as we did in different parts of the class. And so I really enjoyed hearing especially this idea of what a future museum could be. Because to me, that idea of imagining the future is a hopeful one, and one that is a part of what your generation can do.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I felt like that was really exciting. And our return to that at the end of the semester, I don't know if you remember it, I sort of like asked you again, not in exactly the same way, but I think in some ways, my hope is that you students walked away feeling as though you too are stakeholders in the way in which these institutional histories can continue to unfold in the future.
Yeah, I certainly got that sense. I think that it's definitely a relevant issue on the sort of international scene of museums. It's not like it's just being discussed with us. Is it the International Council of
Mm-hmm.
Museums?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds very.
ICOM, yeah.
It sounds very much like people in a dark room and very, very high chairs. I know that they recently had, and we looked at this as part of that definition exercise, sort of a reckoning with their existing definition of what a museum was. It hadn't been meaningfully updated in a long time. And people were trying to bring in some of these ideas about how museums can actually further social progress, things like that, into the actual definition of a museum. And this like totally disrupted ICOM for a couple years and caused people to resign, and it became this whole foo-for-ah. So it's a very hot topic. I mean, it's not like it's very relevant to what museums are doing. But
can I ask you what was your favorite discussion that we had in the class, or what did you sort of what discussion will you remember?
The one that I remember the most was us talking about repatriation in the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
That's one that sticks out in my head. There's a couple that stick out in my head.
What about that discussion? Do you remember?
Yeah, we were supposed to have like a sort of an in-class debate about it.
Yeah.
And I've done like a lot of debates where I've been sort of like assigned a position that I sort of may or may not actually hold.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to formulate an argument for not returning objects from the British Museum. And maybe before I get into this, like, do you want to define what repatriation is, just so that people know what we're talking about?
Yeah, you're really putting me on the spot here,
Sorry,
Peter.
yeah.
So the debate that Peter is referring to is about the Parthenon marbles, which were taken from the Acropolis in Athens by the British Lord Elgin in the early 19th century and now reside in the British Museum. And there is a very controversial and contested debate about whether or not those pieces of the Parthenon should be returned to the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And so the repatriation of these specific objects would mean that the British Museum would give up their ownership and return the Parthenon marbles to Athens and turn over their ownership of them to the Greek government and to the Acropolis. Of course, this is a very brief and reductive description of a very, very long-standing and complicated debate. And I think even after our class ended, there was an article, maybe even in the last week, in The Guardian about how the British Museum and the British government actually can't agree about whether or not these should be returned. And so it's not even like a British-Greek debate. It's actually a British-British internal debate as well, which we didn't even get to talk about in our class.
Yeah, I think part of what said to me about that conversation, which was kind of interesting about trying to get into the arguments for retaining those pieces, was that it was something that I had never particularly taken seriously. I have a little bit of a slant because I'm a classics major, so we had looked at the Parthenon marbles, and so I was sort of like, it was challenging to kind of get into the headspace of why someone might think that it was acceptable or advantageous to kind of keep them.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that I hadn't even really earnestly considered.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people in the class had almost had like a difficulty getting into that debate about defending the British Museum's keeping of it.
Can I interject for 1 second, and maybe it will jog your memory?
Yeah.
One of the things I remember talking about at the end of that debate that I felt was important, and we weren't able to go into this in as much detail simply because we didn't have enough time in the semester, is that this debate has been framed as a kind of binary discussion between England and Greece, modern day England and Greece.
Yes.
And one of the things that I felt was important was to introduce the Ottomans into that discussion, right? The Ottomans, and then, of course, modern day Turkey, which, no longer occupies Greece, of course. But in part because the Ottomans did occupy Athens when the Parthenon marbles were removed and put on boats and taken to England. And supposedly, Lord Elgin had received approval from the Ottoman Sultan in the form of a firman. And so it wasn't that they were stolen, it was that he was supposedly given permission to do so. But the Ottoman antiquities laws changed so dramatically over the course of the 19th century. And the Ottomans, as imperial power became very interested themselves in archaeology and the collection of antiquities, both Assyrian, Greek, Roman, and Islamic objects. And so I think for me, introducing the Ottomans to that conversation and their participation in the
Yeah.
removal of the Parthenon marbles was an important way to think about how can we actually create dissonance or disrupt this kind of binary back and forth
Yeah.
between England and Greece and complicate that conversation.
Yeah.
Not that there's, not to assert, one way or the other, but to say that actually there are other voices in this conversation who are not necessarily part of, who, because of the changes in borders and World War I and the fall of
Yes.
empires and the construction of modern nation states, of course, those histories haven't been as considered. And so I felt like that
Yeah.
was an important thing to point out.
Yeah, I think what stuck to me the most about it was that what we're kind of getting at a little bit is there's what is legal and then there's what's ethical, and the two align together sometimes, and sometimes they don't. And there's that interesting question with Elgin, leaving aside whether he actually really had permission to do that, which is its own sort of can of beans. Assuming that he did, are we just going to abide in the future by what was decided to be legally appropriate some 200 years ago? And are we comfortable with that? Which is an interesting question. I think that the Ottoman inclusion in that conversation really, I think, kind of brought that home, because they had their own distinct shift in their understanding of what to do with objects from antiquity. And so are we just sort of stuck with that one decision for the rest of time? And so far the answer has basically been yes. And the British Museum would also, I'm sure, would interject that, it's developed its own history in Britain now for this long stretch of time. So now that's its own piece of it. And so the idea of who gets to claim ownership over something was, I think, the question that was most interesting to me about that discussion.
Yeah, and I think that that question of ownership is one that is so integral to the formation of collections, right? And collecting institutions.
Because that's what it is. It's owning something.
Yeah, and I think that question really gets at other deeper, not only ethical but philosophical questions about objects, right? And humanity and our desire, this desire to collect, this desire to own, which, also implies power structures and systems of power and power hierarchies, right? Because if you own something, then you are in power over it, right?
Yeah.
And this scholar, Ariella Azoulay, asks the same question about photographs. Can someone own a photograph? And I asked this in my class recently, because is it the photographer that owns the photograph? Is it the subject
that's an open question
that owns the photograph? Is it the museum that owns the photograph? And especially when you're talking about photographs of unnamed subjects or unknown subjects, or subjects who maybe aren't, represented as, or are stateless in some cases, right?
Yeah.
This becomes a really complicated issue. And so I think that this question of ownership over objects is one that's really central to the discussion of decolonizing the museum.
Yeah, and that gets into one of the other really interesting discussions that we had, which was focused on what does it mean to have all these objects in a collection where they actually aren't being seen by anybody? Because I think that was the other one that stuck out the most in my mind when I got to the end of the class. Because at our museum, it's sort of, I almost want to say fortunate in that our collection isn't as big as some other ones, because that way we can actually sort of keep track of where things are and then try and circulate them and use them. But it's incredibly challenging. I don't think almost any collecting museum, if you ask them where is any single object, in the collection that they could actually probably tell you. Most of the time, the bigger it gets, the more often there's sort of ambiguity about where something even is. And if you don't know where it is, how can you really be a good steward?
I do think museums, though, the collection management systems have changed
Yes.
dramatically over the last, say, 10 years. And now most large-scale museums use barcoding systems,
Yes,
like
it's definitely
the
improving a
grocery
lot.
store, right, where they
Yeah.
have every object has a barcode and you can scan it, and it should tell you the exact location of where that object exists or where it lives in the collection.
Right.
Somebody of course, has to make sure that it gets returned there and not
Yeah.
removed from there, and there are always those anomalies. But I
Yeah.
do think that those kinds of digital management systems have hopefully allowed for less error.
Yeah.
It's not to say that it doesn't exist anymore, but
It's certainly improved. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some of that is also just that when an object gets entered into a collection and it's this massive, massive collection, if it never gets used in an exhibition, if it never sees the light of day for whatever
Yeah.
reason, can we really say that that's a good use of the object? There's a certain question about the inherent value of collection, the sort of preservation as being a sort of primary principle of what is sort of good for an object.
yes.
But that is not always the case in terms of what somebody might feel about how an object should be used.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about objects that are added into collections that are in use by somebody in some way that then get sort of, oh, well, we should preserve this and keep it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of scholars, especially Indigenous American scholars, who are really asking those kinds of questions, right? And we read Amy Lone Tree's
Yes.
text in our class, and I think there are, again, that gets to this question, what you're bringing up, I think, connects to that question of ownership, right? Where it becomes like the use value of the object, like not just what the object means, but what it does,
Yeah.
right? Like what does this object do? And that connects to this question of ownership as well, and of course reminds us that ownership doesn't mean the same thing for everyone and for every institution either,
Yeah.
right? That there are
Yeah.
very specific ideas about ownership that are rooted in colonial possession and settler colonial possession, and that's important, I think, to remember
Yeah.
as well.
And it all always gets back to that sort of hierarchy of value as well in terms
Yes,
of what
exactly.
is worthy of being presented to the public
Yes.
and what is not. I mean,
Yes.
we had that discussion about, was it at Baltimore? Was that where they talking about the deaccessioning of the Warhol and those
Exactly,
things?
yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You'll probably you might remember the details better than I would.
Yeah, so the Baltimore Museum of Art was considering deaccessioning 3 paintings by very famous American artists, including Andy Warhol. And this was, I believe, in 2019.
Because very recently,
I'd have to double check the date. And this director and curatorial staff were planning to deaccession them in order to raise funds to diversify the collection and incorporate better pay raises for their other staff members within the museum.
Right.
And the board found this to be very problematic. And ultimately, the museum chose not to deaccession these objects and found other ways to address pay inequity and their interest in finding more diverse representations within the collection. And so, yes, we were talking about, why were people, the board members and other members of the public, so opposed to the deaccessioning of a Warhol, right?
Yeah,
That's
'cause
what you're referring to.
Yeah, because it wasn't even just, what I thought was interesting about it is that there's a little bit of an open question about whether an art museum, deaccessioning something of value is really something, for the purpose of using that money for something else is really in line with their mission. And that's a different question entirely. But the sort of vehement reaction to it, that sort of like, oh, how could we even consider this, was definitely a little bit eye-opening about how those works are valued.
Mhm.
And maybe some of the slightly sort of problematic ideas about what gets valued.
Yeah, well, it also, of course, connects to the market, right?
Yeah.
And
Like, why would that be the driving force of what a museum is, if it's really trying to have it be sort of like this public benefit, like why the market would be driving what is of highest value.
Yeah, but if you're selling, a Clifford Still and a Bryce Martin and a Andy Warhol at
Yeah.
auction, then you want the highest value,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I mean, it's all very, very entangled, and to pretend that museums are not somehow tethered to the art
Yeah.
market is, would be also very problematic.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of course, insurance values are based on market sales, and insurance values are how we decide how much things are worth in museums, and how much
Yeah.
things are worth are implied by the market value, but also by what the public wants to see,
Yeah.
by politics, by so many different factors. And I think going back to your discussion about storage systems and what's on view and what's not on view, I also really enjoyed those 2 days of our class where we
Yeah.
talked about storage and reading the different opinions of scholars about whether or not, keeping works in storage and not viewing them was valuable or not.
Yeah.
And my own personal, since you asked, my own personal response to the idea of storage is that it's not a dead end. That
Yeah.
something that remains in storage and goes unseen is not unvalued,
Yes.
is not actually silenced,
Mm-hmm.
but is just quiet. Like, what if we think about those things as being dormant, but still holding, incredible value, still being able to produce knowledge, and they just haven't
Yes.
been activated yet. They haven't been animated by somebody touching them, somebody seeing them, somebody holding them, right? And so that actually storage could be seen not as a crypt,
Mm-hmm.
but as a really productive space in which things are held. And of course there are
Yeah,
arguments that you could make that that's not true, but I think that seeing art museum storage as a place where other kinds of meanings are being produced
Yes.
instead of just meaning being removed
Yeah.
is an exciting way to think about the different spaces that museums can occupy.
Yeah, and I mean, like I referenced before that I'm a classics major. I definitely see the great value of preserving something. Read a lot about information in monasteries just being preserved over centuries, and the people who are copying the text don't necessarily even know what it says. You can find Latin errors actually from people who don't really understand Latin but are just transcribing it, which I think
Interesting.
is kind of fun. But the information itself was being kept until somebody many, many, many years later could discern something from it and interpret it. And so like I definitely think there is a sort of an inherent value in keeping something around for a later generation to observe. I just think it was an interesting point to even consider that there might be some kind of drawback to that. I think we get into this. I think there's sort of like a baseline acceptance of that having value, and sort of even the idea of questioning it was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think, like, of course, museum storage can be a kind of preservation, but as we did in our class, if we think about that critically,
Yeah.
then it's not just accepting museum storage as preservation, but also observing patterns in
Yes.
museum storage and analyzing what is in storage and what is not,
Mm-hmm.
which allows us to see different kinds of objects and therefore different kinds of histories that have been marginalized, right? That have been left alone,
Yeah.
that have been quieted. And so I think that it's, in some ways, like, thinking about storage as productive is not just accepting it for what it is, but thinking about it critically and instead asking, well, why has the museum retained, this particular object, but nobody's ever seen it?
Yeah.
Like, and that actually that allows us to think about what kinds of stories are not being told.
I'm kind of curious if you think that there is a museum that is a particular favorite of yours, or that really in kind of in particular sort of embodies some of these ideas about what we were talking about museums of the future, kind of what a museum should be. Is there like an institution that you think of as like, that's a really good example of this in action?
This is a great question. And I don't know if one doesn't come to mind right away, like
Right.
like the sort of model museum per se. Let me start with my favorite museums.
Let's do
I think
that.
I think that might be easier.
I would love to
Yeah.
hear that anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, this is so maybe sort of cliche, but I love the Peggy Guggenheim collection, for personal reasons. But I also love a house museum. Like I love personal collections in houses, which Peggy Guggenheim's, this was her villa on the Grand Canal in Venice, the Palazzo dei Leoni.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And it was where she lived till the end of her life and where she brought her work, her collection of artwork. And it was initially a space where she had a room in her house that she would invite people in to see for parts of the day.
Mm.
It's a kind of viewing space.
Oh, interesting.
Before it became a formal museum. And I think the sort of idiosyncrasies of personal habits and collecting can be seen in those house museums. And, for example, all her dogs are buried in the sculpture garden.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Okay.
And another, like Alexander Calder made her a headboard that's still hanging in what was her bedroom. There's no bed in there anymore, at least as far as I remember. And I also love that she was this fierce female collector who kind of, in many ways, refused the heteronormative patriarchal standards that were placed on her and forged her own path in asserting what she thought counted as art, who she thought counted as artists, and created her own vision of what she wanted modern art to be in the middle of the 20th century. And so I not only love the building and the place and the artwork, maybe because I lived with it for several months, but I also love that you feel this fierce feminist who was ahead of her time, I think, in that space.
Just like in the space itself.
Yeah. I think in a way she kind of haunts it, and that's really in a really special way. So I love the Peggy Guggenheim collection.
You're reminding me a lot thinking about the Gardner Museum in
yes, it is
in Boston, because it's one of those interesting things where you can sometimes a cool way to connect with a museum is to the very space itself. You feel like it's an extension of a person.
Yes.
And the Gardner is exactly like that. Like I think anybody who hasn't been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, if you go by the end, I think you'll have a pretty good idea of what Isabella Stewart Gardner was like, which is sort of an interesting window. I think it's sort of oddly transparent in that it kind of has this like, here's what she thought, she felt, here's what she was like, and it's all kind of like laid out in front of you. So you have a really cool window into like why what was collected, and I think that's just a really cool way to experience a museum.
Yeah, and of course Gardner was living, decades before Peggy Guggenheim, and in many ways was kind of a forerunner, right for her, but in the Gilded Age is, competing with people like J.P. Morgan and Frick, and like she was the woman who was doing it. And I think in a way, her life was a prospectus for her museum, and she was really in control of the decisions that were being made, and she saw it as labor, as work. And I think thinking about that is really interesting. So I know right now the Gardner has an amazing show of her photo albums, which everyone should go see.
Yeah. I got to see some of those photos.
Her travel albums.
Yeah, so interesting as a window into how that place was created.
Yeah. I don't know, as far as other favorite museums, I love the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. It's a really special place. I did love in our class talking about Orhan Pamuk's, thinking about Istanbul.
Oh, yeah.
Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is another kind of personal house museum. And the idea of the relationship between literature and words and objects and how stories are constructed narratively through a novel, but then also through a building. So I don't know if that's a museum of the future. I think there's lots of ways we could probably critique that museum too.
Sure.
But I do think that the idea of engaging with what the scholar Christina Sharp would call undisciplined ways of thinking, meaning outside of the discipline, right?
Yeah.
Fictional, imaginary, conversational, collaborative memory work, for example, right? Which is what Pamuk is doing. Not necessarily straightforward, rigid academic scholarship, but really
Right.
thinking about museums in ways that exist outside of the gallery space,
Yeah.
and really work to unlearn the kinds of systems and hierarchies of value, as you said, that we are taught and conditioned to
Right.
believe, right? Which is really
Yeah.
actually engaging in that kind of thinking, and is, I think, an act of decolonizing the museum, because we're addressing systems of power and white supremacy and imperial histories that are built, literally built into the foundation of
Right.
museum structures.
Yeah. If anybody's interested in looking into more about that as well, Palm Week's website has a lot of. He has. I think it's even called. Is it called the manifesto? Is that what it is?
He
has
has
like
a manifesto. Yeah.
Yeah. He has like a big list of
Yeah.
of his ideas, so you can get a pretty clear idea of what
Mhm.
we're talking about there. How do you think some of these ideas that we've been talking about might apply here at the Bates Museum of Art?
Ooh, you're really putting me on the spot.
I know I am a little bit.
Well, I don't work at the Bates College Museum of Art,
Yeah.
so everything I say would be said out of from a place of respect and imagination, I would say. I love working with the Bates Museum of Art. I think that it's an incredible resource for me as a faculty member and for students. And I have brought, I think, all of my classes, if not all but one of them, into the museum, and find using the collection and utilizing the collection, not only in class assignments, but in class lectures, to be really rewarding for the students particularly, and that teaching students about visual literacy and learning from objects is one of the most important kind of objectives of some of my classes.
Mm.
So I think in terms of how, can I rephrase your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Feel free.
So not how can the Bates College Museum of Art apply the things that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I know. It's
but
kind of a little bit
maybe
of
how could the museum ask similar questions of itself,
mm-hmm.
right? So that it becomes about asking questions. I think the museum is already doing that in some ways, asking those kinds of questions. I loved last fall, I'm forgetting, maybe you remember the name of the exhibition that was here when the school year opened.
Pedagogy?
Yeah, the pedagogy show, exactly, where students were asked to write on the wall labels and respond.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really exciting because it was a way of inviting discussions into the gallery rather than the students being told what to think. They were asking questions about what to think. And so I think the kind of community engagement and programming that the museum does is one of the ways that this kind of work can happen. It sounds like the museum is already doing some of these things, And I think that in many ways, I think a lot of it is being self-reflective about the choices that are made, right? What's being shown, what's being collected, who's being invited in. And I think also, as somebody who works with art and visual culture, yes, I'm trained as an art historian, but I as a photo historian, I'm really not interested in art with a capital A.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in more largely visual culture, material culture.
Yeah.
And as you said, interrogating those hierarchies of value, why we're told to believe what counts and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I think, the ways in which the museum engages with not only the AVC department, but other departments too, like music and theater and dance and other departments, as a way to sort of broaden the way we think about what art is and how that can exist within the galleries. And so many of the exhibition proposals from our class.
Right.
So the final assignment in our class was to design an exhibition proposal. And they were all so fabulous. The way yours engaged with objects in the collection at the Bates College Museum of Art in a way of reevaluating what a masterpiece is, asking those kinds of questions, is exactly, I think, the kinds of lines of inquiry that need to be happening.
Right. You could say I had a little bit of a leg up on that. Maybe.
You did. Yeah, you had the insider scoop. And then there were others, for example, that were engaging with dance and choreography and dancers responding to specific objects, or commissioning, asking artists, of course, all of these were, hypothetical, but
Yeah, right.
asking artists to respond to dances and movement, and thinking about the way in which objects perform histories and bodies perform histories. And
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
I think that there's so many ways at a college like Bates where the museum can be more expansive and more capacious in the way that it defines art. And I think the museum is already doing that in so many ways.
Yeah. And of course, we love to hear feedback. So if you have more ideas about how to do that, we would love to connect with the arts community in Bates in the best way that we can. So I think we're going to wrap up.
Okay.
But this was a really great discussion. Thank you for coming on and doing this.
Thank you for having me. I loved having, you join our class, and I'm glad that it's staying with you outside of the classroom.
It most definitely is. So, yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you.